The Odyssey drifted through the abyss of space, its metallic hull gleaming faintly under the dim light of a dying red star. This was not a journey of discovery, but a response, an enigmatic signal, pulsing from the void of an uncharted system, had drawn them here. No one knew its origin, but the intricacy of its frequency patterns spoke of intelligence. High Command had sent their best, scientists, engineers, and soldiers, led by the stalwart Captain Liam Voss. Among them was Dr. Elena Kartos, a xenobiologist renowned for her work on alien ecosystems. Her curiosity burned brighter than any star, but even she couldn't ignore the ominous silence surrounding this place. The system was a graveyard. Planets lay shattered, their remains forming ghostly rings around their dead cores. Scans revealed no signs of life, yet orbiting the third planet was something unnatural, a colossal fragment of a station, battered and scarred, suspended in the weak gravitational pull. As the Odyssey approached, its surface became clearer. The structure, composed of an iridescent black alloy, seemed to shift under observation, as though it breathed. "Magnificent," Elena whispered as they descended. The landing party, 2 scientists and 3 armed Marines, stepped cautiously onto the alien floor. The atmosphere was dense but breathable, infused with a faint metallic tang. The station's interior was vast and disorienting. Corridors stretched endlessly, their walls glowing with an organic, pulsating light. "These patterns," Elena muttered, running her gloved hand across the wall. "They're not just decorative, they might be neural pathways or something alive." Diaz, one of the Marines, snorted nervously. "Alive? Doc, if these walls start talking, I'm out." They pressed on, finding chambers filled with remnants of a civilization long gone. The beings that had once thrived here were enormous. Their skeletal remains stretched across the floor like shattered monuments. Their elongated limbs and crystalline eyes, now dulled and lifeless, spoke of an intelligence far beyond human comprehension. In one chamber, the team discovered a massive wall engraved with fractal designs. As Elena approached, her helmet's light illuminated the intricate carvings. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the surface. The moment she touched it, the wall pulsed violently, emitting a deep, resonant hum. A hologram flickered to life, its luminous form depicting one of the alien beings. Its voice was mournful, echoing through the chamber in an alien language that the translation matrix struggled to parse. "We were the Xerians," it finally managed in a halting tone. "We thrived. We were consumed." Consumed. The word hung in the air like a curse. The hologram began to depict images, a swirling, malevolent mist descending upon their cities, twisting their forms into grotesque shapes. They came from beyond. We called them the Stormmakers. They turned us into their horror. The message abruptly ceased, plunging the chamber into silence. Then came a sound, a faint, scraping noise, distant yet sharp. It echoed through the corridors, setting every nerve on edge. "Did anyone else hear that?" Diaz whispered, his voice barely audible. Elena exchanged a glance with Captain Voss, her eyes wide with realization. "We're not alone here." The faint scraping sound grew louder, echoing through the labyrinthine corridors of the alien station. The team's breathing quickened as they instinctively huddled closer, their flashlights darting across the shadowed walls. Captain Voss raised his hand, signaling the group to stop. His voice, low but firm, cut through the tense silence. "Diaz, keep an eye on our 6. Dr. Kartos, stay close," he ordered, his gaze fixed ahead. The air felt heavier now, charged with an almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Elena's mind raced as she analyzed their surroundings. The walls appeared to pulse faster, their once rhythmic glow becoming erratic. It was as if the station itself was reacting to their presence. "I think it's aware of us," Elena said, her voice trembling with a mixture of awe and fear. "Aware? You're saying this place is alive?" Diaz asked, his tone dripping with skepticism, though his grip on his weapon tightened. Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she knelt by a cluster of crystalline growths protruding from the floor. They shimmered faintly, their translucent surfaces refracting the dim light. Carefully, she tapped one with a scanner. The device buzzed as streams of alien data scrolled across its screen. "Not alive in the way we understand it," she replied. "Finally. But it's not just a structure, it's reactive, like some sort of biomechanical organism." As she spoke, the scraping noise returned, this time accompanied by a wet, slithering sound. It was closer, too close. "Move!" Voss barked, motioning the team forward. They hurried down a narrow corridor, its walls closing in like the gullet of a great beast. Diaz muttered curses under his breath, while Elena clutched her scanner tightly, her eyes darting between the walls and the path ahead. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, the largest they had seen yet. Towering pillars of black metal rose to the ceiling, their surfaces etched with glowing fractal patterns. In the center of the chamber stood a massive structure, its form resembling a giant obelisk, but its surface was alive with movement. Tendrils of light crawled across it, shifting like liquid fire. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This is it. "The core," she whispered, her voice tinged with reverence and dread. The obelisk seemed to react to her words, emitting a deep, resonant hum. As the sound reverberated through the chamber, shapes began to emerge from the shadows. At first, they appeared as silhouettes, their forms distorted and unnatural. But as they drew closer, their true horror was revealed. The figures were humanoid yet grotesquely altered. Extra limbs jutted out at impossible angles, their skins stretched taut over unnatural growths. Their faces bore multiple eyes, some glowing faintly, others lifeless and clouded. They moved with a jerky, uneven gait as though something unseen was pulling their strings. "My God," Diaz whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're not dead," Elena said, her voice thick, with emotion. These are the Xerians, what's left of them." One of the creatures raised a spindly arm, pointing towards the obelisk. Its gaze, if it could be called that, locked onto Elena, and in that moment, she felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. Not fear, but sorrow. "It's trying to tell us something," she said, stepping closer. "Elena, no," Voss called out, but she ignored him. As she approached the obelisk, the tendrils of light shifted, forming what looked like symbols in midair. She stared at them, her mind racing to decode their meaning. Behind her, the creatures stood motionless, as if waiting for her next move. And then the chamber shook, the obelisk's hum intensifying. It was no longer waiting, it was reacting. The chamber trembled violently, as the obelisk's hum grew louder, reverberating through the massive pillars like a thunderous heartbeat. Elena stood frozen, staring at the symbols dancing in midair. They shifted and twisted, their meaning elusive, yet she felt an overwhelming sense of urgency emanating from them. Behind her, the team prepared for the worst, their weapons aimed at the grotesque creatures that remained eerily still, as if held in place by an unseen force. "Eleanor, step back, now!" Voss shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. She ignored him, her hands trembling as she reached out toward the symbols. They seemed to respond, elongating and rearranging themselves into patterns her mind could almost, but not quite, grasp. Suddenly, her scanner emitted a piercing beep. She glanced at the screen, which displayed a cascade of unreadable alien data. Her breath hitched. "It's a neural interface," she said aloud, her voice shaking. "The obelisk isn't just a machine. It's a central hub designed to connect with living minds. It's trying to communicate." "Or control you," Diaz interjected, his tone laced with fear. "You don't know what it's doing." Elena hesitated, her fingers hovering just inches from the glowing symbols. The obelisk seemed to pulse in anticipation, its tendrils of light rippling outward. The Xerian creatures, as if in response, let out low, mournful groans, their twisted forms quivering. "I don't think it wants to harm us," Elena said softly, almost to herself. "It's desperate." "Desperate? For what?" Voss barked, his patience wearing thin. She turned to face him, her eyes wide and filled, with a mixture of fear and understanding. "For survival. I think it's all that's left of their species. This," she gestured to the obelisk and the creatures, "this is their last fragment, clinging to existence. It's trying to reach out, but it doesn't understand us." Before Voss could respond, the obelisk emitted a sudden, high-pitched tone. The symbols flared brightly, blinding the team momentarily. When the light dimmed, they saw a new projection, this time of Earth. The images were stark and brutal. Forests burned, cities crumbled, and oceans churned with toxic sludge. Wars played out in rapid succession, soldiers in trenches, nuclear, detonations and masses of displaced people crying out in despair. It was humanity's darkest moments, laid bare in vivid detail. The team stared in stunned silence. Even Diaz lowered his weapon, his face pale. What is this?" he stammered. Elena stepped closer to the projection, her voice a whisper. "It's our history. But why?" The obelisk shifted again, this time displaying new symbols alongside the images of Earth. Elena studied them, her mind racing. The meaning clicked into place like a puzzle piece. "It sees us as a paradox," she said, her voice breaking. "A species capable of unimaginable destruction, but also creation. It's analyzing us, trying to decide if we're its salvation or its doom." As the words left her mouth, the Xerian creatures began to move. Slowly, painfully, they shuffled toward the obelisk, their bodies contorting further with each step. One of them raised its skeletal arm toward Elena, its many eyes locking onto hers. "It's not just observing," she realized, "it's testing us." The obelisk's hum grew deeper, more resonant, as if it were alive and waiting for the team's next move. The obelisk's hum deepened into a low, bone-shaking resonance, and the chamber began to feel alive with anticipation. Elena stood frozen, her mind racing as the alien symbols continued to shift before her. The Xerian creatures stopped there. "Advance," forming a semicircle around the obelisk as if awaiting some unseen command. Their warped, grotesque forms twitched sporadically, their glowing eyes fixed unblinking on the human team. Voss stepped forward, his weapon trained on the obelisk. His face was hard, his jaw tight with determination. "We can't let this thing do whatever it's planning," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If it's testing us, we have to make a choice." "And what choice is that?" Elena asked, turning to him with desperation in her voice. "Destroy it," he replied simply. Elena's eyes widened in horror. "Destroy it? Are you insane? We don't even know what it's capable of. It's not just a machine, Voss. It's alive. Killing it might unleash something we can't control. And leaving it intact might do the same thing," Voss snapped, his voice rising. He gestured toward the Xerian creatures. "Look at them, Elena. Whatever this thing did to them, it'll do to us if we give it the chance." Diaz shifted nervously, his gaze darting between the obelisk and the captain. "Maybe the doc's right," he said hesitantly. "What if blowing it up makes things worse?" Before Voss could respond, the obelisk pulsed violently, and a deep guttural voice emanated from the chamber, speaking in fractured, halting English. "Choice must be made." The words reverberated through the room, the voice a chilling amalgamation of tones, some human, others utterly alien. Elena's heart pounded as she turned back to the obelisk. "It's waiting for us to decide," she murmured. "Then we decide," Voss said, stepping closer to the core. He reached for the explosive charges strapped to his belt, his movements slow and deliberate. "Wait," Elena cried, grabbing his arm. "We don't have to destroy it, there's another way." "And what's that?" Voss asked, his tone sharp. "I'll connect with it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "It's a neural interface, remember? If I link my mind to it, I can overload its systems, shut it down from the inside." "That's suicide," Voss said, his expression hardening. "It's the only way to be sure it doesn't harm us, or anything else," Elena replied. She stepped closer to the obelisk, her hands trembling but resolute. "You wanted a choice, Captain. This is mine." The chamber fell silent, except for the steady hum of the obelisk. Voss clenched his jaw, his eyes flickering with conflict. Finally, he nodded. "You're not doing this alone," he said. Elena turned to him, surprised. "If you're linking up, I'll be here to pull you out if it goes wrong," Voss continued. "We're not losing anyone today." As she approached the obelisk, the tendrils of light began to shift, reaching out toward her. The air felt electric, charged with an almost tangible energy. Elena took a deep breath and placed her hands on the core. A shockwave of light erupted from the obelisk, engulfing the chamber. Voss shielded his eyes, shouting Elena's name, but his voice was lost in the roar of energy. The Xerian creatures let out a collective wail, their twisted bodies writhing as the light consumed them. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the light faded. Elena's body stood rigid, her eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the obelisk. The chamber was deathly silent. Voss took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding. "Elena," he called out, his voice barely a whisper. She turned to face him, her expression blank, her glowing eyes unblinking. When she spoke, her voice was layered with 1,000 tones, both hers and something entirely other. "It understands now." The obelisk pulsed one final time, and the chamber began to shake violently, the walls cracking as a deafening roar filled the air. The chamber collapsed around them, fragments of the alien structure falling like shards of blackened glass. Voss stumbled backward, shielding his face as the obelisk emitted one final blinding pulse of energy. The sound was deafening, a roar that seemed to tear through both the air and their minds. "Elena!" he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. The Xerian creatures writhed in agony as the energy consumed them, their grotesque forms disintegrating into streams of glowing particles. The light swirled upward, merging into the cracks forming on the obelisk's surface. A deafening crack reverberated through the chamber as the obelisk split in two, and a surge of energy knocked Voss off his feet. When the light faded, the chamber was eerily silent. Voss coughed, pushing himself up from the rubble. His ears rang and his vision was blurred, but he scanned the room desperately. "Elena!" he called again, his voice hoarse. At the center of the now destroyed obelisk stood Elena. Her body was slumped forward, her arms hanging limp at her sides. The glow in her eyes had vanished, replaced by a glassy emptiness. Voss ran to her side, gripping her shoulders. "Elena, it's over. We're getting out of here," he said, shaking her gently. She blinked slowly, her gaze unfocused. When she finally spoke, her voice was faint, but no longer layered with the alien resonance. "It let go," she murmured. "What do you mean?" Voss asked, his brow furrowing. Before she could answer, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep rumble echoed through the ruins, and Elena's eyes widened with alarm. "We have to go," she said weakly, her strength returning just enough to grab Voss's arm. The two of them stumbled toward the exit, navigating the crumbling corridors as the station began to implode. The walls around them pulsed erratically, flickering between life and death. Behind them, the remnants of the obelisk emitted a final burst of light that surged outward like a shockwave. They barely made it to the surface in time. The alien station collapsed in on itself, imploding into a singularity of light before vanishing completely. The sky above was now clear. The strange mists dissipated. On board the Odyssey, the remaining crew rushed to meet them. Diaz was the first to help them up the ramp, his face pale with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "What the hell happened down there?" he asked, his voice shaking. Voss glanced at Elena, who looked exhausted but resolute. "It's over," he said. "The obelisk is gone." Elena didn't respond. Instead, she walked silently to one of the observation windows, staring out at the void where the station had been. Voss joined her, standing quietly for a moment before speaking. "You saved us," he said. Elena shook her head. "No, it saved us." "What?" Voss asked. Confused, Elena turned to face him, her expression somber. "The obelisk wasn't trying to destroy us. It was trying to warn us. It absorbed the horrors of the Xerians, their mistakes, their pain. When it saw us, it saw the same potential for destruction, but also something else. Something the Xerians didn't have." "What was that?" Voss asked. "Hope," she replied. "It understood that we're capable of more than just destruction. That's why it let go. It gave us the chance to prove it." As her words sank in, the ship's sensors suddenly beeped. A glowing particle cloud appeared on the monitor, moving slowly away from the site of the station's destruction. "What is that?" Diaz asked, staring at the screen. Elena's voice was quiet but steady. "What's left of the obelisk, it's dispersing itself, seeding the galaxy. It's not gone. It's watching, waiting to see what we do next. Voss stood silently, his gaze fixed on the monitor. "Then we better make it count," he said finally, his voice heavy with determination. The Odyssey moved forward, the glowing particles fading into the vastness of space, leaving the crew with a sense of both relief and responsibility.